please join us. And yeah, next, the most awaited moment. We have Jennifer, and we have heard for this session on SSRF and attack path reviews. And I hand it over to you, Jennifer, for the event.
Thanks a million. There's some really pretty cool events and initiatives you have coming up. I was making notes of all of them, so I can go and look into the details of them afterwards. Well done. Clearly you've all been working really, really hard on these. Just bear with me 1 second now. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So the goal for me today is to talk about SSRF, server-side request forgeries, and then that's the primary focus because I know that you've been WAS focused for a while now. And then I'm going to put in a small summary as such at the end on what attack path reviews are and what attack paths and reviews are and what the benefits of those things are. I suspect maybe at a later point we'll come back and do something in more detail on attack paths and reviews because there's so much out there that trying to give you the best of everything in this one session was never going to be possible, but I just want to put a little taster at the end because it's something that I see a lot of people in my industry talking more and more and more about. So let's sow the seed and see what your thoughts are on that. So before I get started, I guess I'll introduce myself. My name is Jennifer Cox. I work in cybersecurity. I have been doing so now for 6 years. Consulting with customers all over the globe on best practices around cybersecurity and how to carry out everything from vulnerability management to maintaining safe networks. I have 16 years in tech, and I'm heavily involved in all things women in tech. Came across BBWIC through Harini, who was mentioned there earlier, who's a proper little legend, introduced me to this, and I haven't looked back since. Met a fantastic group of women and allies, and really enjoying the time here. So let's get to it. Okay, so the very first thing people generally ask when we talk about server-side request forgeries is, well, what's the difference between that and CSRF? So let's get that out of the way first. Server-side request forgeries are where we're targeting a server-side application. That application runs on server. Seems obvious, but we'll put it out there. Client-side request forgery is targeting applications that run in a browser. That's the main difference, and I have the two go-to diagrams with your typical hacker with the hoodie on or the hacker in the bad hat, just to show you what that looks like in a diagram difference as such. Because CSRF is client side, it uses a very specific client session, so it tricks the user into sending a web request that they didn't intend to do. It generally exploits the trust that a site has in a user's browser. So examples of this would be things like when they're purchasing products or changing a password or sending a message. That if you think kind of social engineering where a user's tricked into clicking on a URL that sends a malicious request to a target website, that's the kind of idea with CSRF. Typically it also contains credentials that belong to the user, and that's where the session's cookies come into it. But SSRF is different. So what is SSRF and a server-side request forgery, and how does it work? So you'll notice those doors, and I wonder does anybody recognize them straight off the bat? And those are the doors from Monsters Inc. And when I think of SSRF, I imagine a room full of doors where your hacker is attempting to knock on or open each one of those doors, and they're just going to try one after another until they eventually get one that's unlocked. And by unlocking that one, there's the potential behind that door for there to be keys for every other door that they can see. That's the simplest way of putting it then from there. So behind any public websites, there's typically all kinds of servers and databases and services that they're not intended to be accessible to the public. Generally, people don't plan to do that, and generally people protect themselves well from that. But if an attacker is trying to exploit via server-side request forgery, what they need to do is find a weak spot where they can gain access so that they can abuse the trust relationship between that public website and the internal systems. So the way that they would do this would be to send requests from an exploited vulnerable web application. So how do they find the exploit? And I have these commands here, and I'll go through them with you in 2 minutes. So what the SSRF does is it exposes the target that they get access to other attack types as well. So it's not just a case of getting access to that target, but depending on the level of access they can get to that target, they could be exposed in other ways too, beyond just stealing data, but also can use that then to gain access to other parts of the network and do other damage then from there. The way it begins is the attacker will attempt to gather information that's unintended for their external use, such as IP addresses, port access configuration, things like that. And in most cases, when this happens, the victims are entirely unaware that it's happening. It's not that you will see an increase in traffic or anything like that, that it's very difficult to detect that it is happening. Once the hacker gets access, they can trick the trusted systems into sending the request to a different backend service, typically something that the hacker has access to, and then potentially reroute any sensitive data then from there. So if you look at those top two lines in green and blue, if the top line there where we have page equals login is something that we typically know to exist on most websites that have credentials. So what if we're going to take this down to ground level? Let's assume the attacker has no knowledge of scripting or automating anything and is just going to manually attempt an old school attack. That they would begin by identifying a page that they know exists and then start changing the address to find other pages that they would assume exist. So the blue example there is an assumed site. And then they'll move from there, depending on their findings, into other things and, again, essentially knock on another door and see what they can find out then by knocking on that door. So say port 22, for example, here is typically used for SSH. Let's say that I use my site and I attempt to target known internal IP addresses, and I've gone through the 192.168.1.2, and worked my way up, and eventually I find that I'm getting something on 15 and port 22. It'll give me access or information with regards to what services might be running on that port. I could take it further then and use some presumed already known text files. So say robots.txt, just about every website has that. And it gives information around, so robots.txt is used to ask different web crawlers to ask them to crawl or not crawl specific parts of the website. This is why every website has it. And there's these things called spiders that look for the file, and it's possible then to ban unwanted spiders by editing your htaccess file associated with your website. So it's really important in the robots.txt, in relation to the robots.txt, that you don't ban all spiders from accessing your site, because then you won't ever turn up in a search result and you're not going to get much traffic to your site. But you need to be also cautious that you don't put things in your robot.txt and allow them to crawl pages that are important or should be kept private then from there. But robots.txt exists on all websites. So that's a typical text file that they might attempt to access and see what's there in that case. Checking the server status. Basic, day one, I want to see what's running on it and what the server's current role is, what function it might be performing, or if it's performing a function as a part of a cluster, then what is that? So there's some typical examples of what on a day one a hacker attempting an SSRF might use. At the bottom I have put in the AWS meta service IP. This is what it's known to be, and I have an asterisk on it because it's going to be relevant later. I just want to put it in and say that if a hacker was attempting to access a company's AWS meta service details, they might use that site to do so. So that leads me to Capital One. So Capital One is the biggest known exposure of an SSRF attack. It was back in 2019, so that's a good sign, because if it was back in 2019 and we're living in 2022, it means that there hasn't been a significant size attack since Capital One, and I have looked hard. So from the perspective of companies protecting themselves well, they have been doing since then. And Capital One really, it piqued my interest because of the simplicity of the attack, and I guess the naive, I don't know if naive is the word, the simplicity of the remediation for the attack as well. It wasn't something that was particularly complicated that needed to be put in place. So here's what happened. Paige Thompson, who was known as Erratic, that was her username, used Tor, the Onion network, to attempt connections to Capital One to develop command scripts and other readiness activities. Multiple connections were made to connect to the servers, and then to download the pilot files and then to test end-to-end scenarios. So she kind of reached out to try and see what she could do, again knocking on all those doors to see which ones are unlocked and where you can gain the access. That was between January and July that those attacks were attempted. On the 21st of April, the data that was stolen from Capital One was posted publicly on GitHub, on page on Erratic's GitHub. There was 3 commands that were used for the attack, which when I read them I went, really? Because it seemed so simple when I heard them first. One was get credentials. So that was the very first command that they executed when they obtained the security credentials. So WAF role from a WAF role account. So the web application firewall account credentials. When they basically got an IAM account access then through that, and got elevated role access for that WAF, for the AWS web application firewall. The second command that they ran was list buckets. So when they executed with the security credentials that they had now got, they were able to list all of the files and folders, aka their S3 buckets, using the some bucket reference. So I have down there the commands that I'm talking about running in the black box there. So you'll see the IAM security credentials and IAM security credentials in use for the WAF role, then listing the files, and then some bucket to see what's to list the files and folders, the S3 bucket details there too. So simple, that one little black box and the amount of damage that can be done from it. The third file that they ran, and I'd love to pop quiz, but I'm sure you can all guess, or third command that they ran, I'm sure you can all guess what it would be, and that is download files. So it seems so easy. What have you got? Or give me your credentials. What have you got that's available to me? Download it. It did. You can see why I went, what? When I read about it, because it seems so simple. So once they had those credentials and they downloaded those files that were accessible with those credentials, and these were, like I say, high-level credentials that were there, a huge amount of customer data was stolen. So it was listed in some places as 700 folders worth, but I'll tell you in a minute exactly how much data that was. So the attacker got brave, shared the data on this on GitHub in April, and then in June, so a significant amount of time after the attack was executed, the attacker then shared the data, boasted about having it on a public Slack channel where people had meetup sessions. So somebody, there was an external researcher who was a member of that Slack channel and saw the post in July, again nearly a whole other month later, and then took a screenshot of it and sent those details by email to Capital One and said, I think you might need to check this out. So at this stage, we're potentially 7 months later that are beyond the original attack haven't happened. Capital One investigated it, and 10 days later they went public with the details of the attack. The response was pretty quick once they validated what had happened and what was out there, and then there was an investigation. She was arrested, but what was stolen is the interesting part then. So during the attack, the attacker implemented and received those AWS credentials. They used it. They stole personal data. They weren't just stealing, headers and pictures. Nothing exciting like that. They were out there to get what was most valuable and what they could do the most damage with, essentially, from there. They got 100 million, so 700 folders worth was 100 million Capital One customers that were in the US and 6 million Capital One customers that were in Canada. It's all of their details in relation to their credit cards accounts. They also had 140,000 social security numbers and 80,000 linked bank account numbers. Is one of the biggest attacks possible. And again, I had to go back when I read up about it. I had to go back and look again, and that was through running get credentials, list buckets, download files, because they were able to get all the access that they needed through vulnerability in their WAF from there. So the application that was found to have the vulnerability was, of course, the web application firewall, and there was mod security on it. The firewall that was vulnerable accepted the malicious request from the attacker. The request then queried the metadata service using that IP address I showed you earlier for AWS's metadata service. and then used the security credentials command, which returned the AWS IAM role, which is the identity and access management. If you've ever had to configure anything in AWS, it's very much the golden ticket, and everybody's super cautious about ever giving out any of those credentials to anyone for any purpose, as they should be. So IAM roles are kind of like an alternative to a long life user access keys and secrets. So rather than hard coding the access key into the app would then request the credentials from the metadata endpoint. So if you query the metadata endpoint and you get those credentials from there, off you go. You can do plenty of things with the IAM role access. So the role that was shared, or stolen, I guess is the better way of putting it, was found to have significant permissions, including access to that customer data that was stored in S3 bucket, which is simple cloud storage service for anyone who doesn't know that. And AWS have been telling people for a significant amount of time now that S3 buckets are known to be vulnerable, and there's something that you need to check your security on and make some improvements if you still have them. So what's improved since, and going into preventing against SSRF? What's improved on the AWS side? All they had to do to fix the issue was to upgrade their firewall. Had they have upgraded to a newer version of it, they'd have been in a better position. So what they did was they implemented version 2 of that metadata service, and now it requires a token in order to query it, where it didn't before. But something that's really important to know is even if you're on version 2 of the AWS metadata service, it's still optional to enable that token. So you still could be as vulnerable as they were back in 2019 if you don't enable the need to require a token when you're querying it from there. So potentially there's still some customers that can be exposed if they're less well informed or less well educated on how this can work. I'm going to share some links after this with the slides, which will cover best practices around AWS governance and help people prevent attacks. And I'll send the case study too, which was details from the FBI investigation, which is just quite interesting to have a look and see what you can about what happened. So what do? We want to prevent against SSRF attacks. So SSRF wasn't considered a significant risk before Capital One's exposure, and honestly it's still not considered a significant risk because the attack itself is super simple and super easy to defend against. The problem is the configuration and making sure that you don't have any holes in your configuration and such from there. But with more and more companies that are moving to cloud native development, the risk is going to increase, because with that move to the cloud, not all of the companies are as savvy or as educated or have the right resources on board to be able to maintain it effectively. So with more companies moving to the cloud, we have an increased attack surface, and that's due to more network connections and back-end services that are in the cloud. So identifying those attacks is more critical than it ever was before. So more commonly detected for client to server web requests, but service to service requests shouldn't be ignored because they're becoming more increasingly targeted. What could Capital One have done to prevent against SSRF in this case? Update their WAF was one, update the metadata service, which they did in the end, was another. And they could have implemented a rule in response to a potential attack. So enabled auto remediation in the event that a vulnerability was found and it was down to a configuration issue, that the configuration could be modified as soon as a specific commands have been run, and change the rules then as such at that point. So auto remediation works as a level of defense, and it can be used to correct those misconfigurations once they've identified it as part of an integrated policy-driven framework. So you need to have policies, know exactly what you want to have set where in order for it to correct any of those configurations based on certain activities. If the AWS IP for metadata service appears in a request header, or in a query or in post arguments, it would be possible to block or flag that request. That's something that could be done too. And then there's a whole host of AWS governance best practices. I just said I'm going to send on a link to those rather than go through them all on the slides. But they can be put in place to prevent against these specific attacks. There's nothing particularly complicated in it, but it's good to have that checklist of configurations to have in place. So you can either put them in place as part of a manual deployment, or in a perfect world, of course, put them in place as part of your IAC, so your infrastructure as code, automation within the DevOps pipeline. So if it's part of your IAC, then those misconfigurations would be prevented from ever making it into a production environment in the first place. So the OWASP Top 10, SSRF with regards to the OWASP Top 10, it has never been on the OWASP Top 10 until the newest list in 2021. This shows some of the mapping for OWASP Top 10. It's a hard one to say. Say it 10 times, I dare you. But to map the 2017 to 2021, you can see the changes that have been made there, such as the top 2 now have moved further down the list. But what the OWASP team have done is they've now started adding into the top 10 some of the items from the community survey. So this community survey category represents a scenario where the security community members tell the OWASP team as such what's important, even though it may not necessarily be illustrated in the data that they're seeing on attacks during that time. 2 were selected from that category. They had the little asterisks on it, and you'll see number 9 there, security logging and monitoring failures. And then number 10, for the first time ever, server-side request forgery has made it into the top 10 for OWASP. The interesting thing about that there is, like, say, there's no data that illustrates that there's more of these attacks happening, but the community are testifying essentially to say that they believe that it's a higher risk for companies. And I guess the proof is in the pudding when you see the exposure from Capital One, that the level of damage done by that such a simple attack is significant, and therefore it should be something that people are bearing in mind when they're talking about compliance and maintaining safe systems, that they should be ensuring that they protect against SSRF at all costs. So that is your SSRF, and I'm just going to do a little bit on attack paths and reviews. So I have it as a quick fire as such from here. So what are they? What are attack paths, and what are attack path reviews and attack path maps and things like that? Attack paths are exactly as they sound. They're the path for which a hacker may attack. They may move systems around. They may travel through your network, and that in itself is the attack path. What I see a lot of companies doing more and more so these days is working to map their potential attack paths, whether they map them against something such as meter attack lists, or they just map the potential attacks that are there. It helps them to get a visual view on where they are at risk in the system and the criticality or severity of that potential attack that's there. This diagram here shows you a typical visual of attack path. There are some really, really beautiful ones out there actually, and it's a wonder I haven't seen any internet art displays yet showing attack paths. I've seen some lovely kind of spider diagrams and hexagonal diagrams showing network pictures in physical views and all how everything connects to everything else. So in this case, you've got an attacker on the outside and the systems that they can connect to, which connect to other systems, and how far in they can get and what they can access by linking from one to the next to the next to the next, like leapfrog, or is that what we used to call it? Yeah, like leapfrog, going from one to the next in there. So attack paths are considered a proactive approach. In an ideal world, nobody wants to be reactive to a vulnerability. They would like to get ahead of the game all the time. And by identifying attack paths, and especially with APMs, attack path mapping, which is similar to this view here, you can, it's a lot easier to identify the risks and also to demonstrate those risks to other people within certain companies and certain industries, where everybody needs to appreciate where the risk is at. It helps with risk assessment and then reducing your risk if you're able to be, like even in the example here, what we have are nodes that have malicious behaviors, nodes that are expected to have, so malicious behaviors being the red ones, those that are expected to, or have nodes that have expected behaviors, ones that are not a problem as such, the green ones. Nodes of rare behaviors but not associated with an incident are the yellow ones, and nodes with an incident but are not part of this particular attack. So the color coding is really important in this case as well to help people to identify the risks. In order to always have your attack path as current as possible, you need to do continuous discovery. You need to always be aware of what is on your network or what is connected to your network or as part of your domain. It's all well and good to have taken a snapshot essentially of that on Monday of last week, but if something has connected to your network or the traffic direction has changed on your network on Wednesday and you don't have information until next Monday because you're not snapshotting again, then you are 5 days behind the curve with regards to potential attack via a new founded attack path from there. So the goal with attack paths is that you're going to determine the tool coverage and the gaps in your defense strategies. It's about knowing what you don't know. It's a phrase I used to always love. I need to know what I don't know, because then how can I know what I need to know? So if you can identify the gaps in your defense strategies, then you can fill those gaps and you have a much better defense strategy that's in place. It can provide alternatives showing overlaps in your defense strategies. So where tools can be reduced or eliminated if you have something that's in place that's protecting more than it needs to, or if you've got tools that are both protecting one particular area of your network, maybe you can reduce your need for those tools and only use one that has the wider span. That can save you money. That's always important. And it can save you effort because you're only maintaining maybe one solution in that case. You can align your monitoring and detection capabilities so that the organizations focus on the right parts of the network. Air gap networks, generally not a problem. Unless somebody can physically get into the building and get to that network, it's safe. So you might as well be putting your detection capabilities in the areas at which you could have some external access. It's important to assess whether there's gaps in tool talent or in resource constraints that may result in the security team being less effective as well. So essentially, it's not just about your physical network, the solutions that you have in place. It also is about the intelligence that you have in place. It's all well and good to map out an attack path, but if you're trying to map attack paths with people who don't fully appreciate or understand how networks work or how certain types of assets play together, then you may miss potential attack paths and not actually improve your defense strategies based on that. You can increase your resiliency as your hackers and your adversaries continually adapt their operations over time. So you just get better at what it is that you do. And of course, the more you map and the more you work on your mapping, the easier it's going to be to think the way that a hacker thinks and appreciate other possible ways of getting into your systems. You can connect your countermeasures, your weaknesses, and the adversaries, and get greater insight into gaps. So what you can do in that case is you can identify different means of attack and maybe color code them into visual representation so you can see the different kinds of attacks that are there. So imagine this attack mapping it against a social engineering attack versus an actual SSRF, say, attack. They could be two very different approaches, but it's important to see how they can happen. And then you can prioritize the future tools that you need, any future training that you need, and any resource investments that you need. So let's say you identify that one specific part of your network is the most at risk of being attacked and that has the most potential to damage any internal systems or allow access to other internal systems, but you can't change much about that side of the network. Then maybe it's time to start looking at different kinds of tools or training the people that are maintaining those networks to a better standard of security practices and management, or just bringing more resources in or better kit or something in from there. Again, it's about knowing what you didn't know before. So that's a quick summary on attack path reviews. Like I say, that's just a few little points, but there's so much in it and it's fascinating to me anyway. And like I say, it would also make a great art display, just saying. If you Google some of the attack path the mapping and images, it's great. So that's me for today. I'll just throw up a few socials there in case anybody wants to connect. But yeah, if there's anything else, you have any questions or anything, then just let me know.
I have a question,
great.
Jennifer.
Yeah?
Sorry.
Sorry. Go for it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer, I really appreciate what you just did. I know it looks very brief, but you've really captured so many things in a couple of slides, and good job for that. My question is, on a typical day, right? People do things like penetration testing, the traditional penetration testing. But
Mhm.
as we can see, right, lots of people are using cloud services. So it means that cloud pen testing
Yeah.
is is bound to overshadow the traditional one. What would you suggest in terms of training, right? Like training to, if someone wants to get a certification and things like that, what would you suggest? Because in the future, if people are working from home or working from remote places, they're bound to use cloud services. And
Yeah.
those things need to be tested, like pen testing. What would you suggest that people should go for?
So, what I've learned, probably in the last, say, even 6 months to a year, between doing mentorship, between the role that I'm in and various events and stuff that I've been at, is that there's not nearly as much cloud excellence, shall I say, or cloud qualified people out there, nowhere near what we need to fulfill all the spots required, if you know what I mean. I see a lot of companies looking for people that are cloud security professionals and have had experience for 10 years, which doesn't make any sense to me because the kind of technology we have in place now hasn't been in place for that length of time. But to answer your question, there are cloud security architects are the ones that I see the greatest interest in big companies. And as a cloud security architect, I think both AWS and Azure offer training in that, and there's actually a lot of training that's free through women in tech communities. Um, so keep an eye out through them for any initiatives that are happening. I know recently there was cloud security architect ones on AWS that were completely free to anyone that was in a diverse or minority group. But those to begin with, it depends, like if you're starting from scratch, you're going to want to go into just whatever your level 1 cloud training is, but making the assumption that you have some sort of a security background, the cloud security architect for sure. Because the biggest challenge that I've seen people have when they've moved to cloud environments and they're maintaining cloud environments is truly understanding attack paths, for want of a better way of putting it. If you have your where am I at? The diagrams, like, this is super super small, but if you Google cloud security attack paths, and all joking aside with the pretty images and all the rest of it, you could see hundreds of thousands of assets like that. And if you don't understand the architecture, the network architecture of your environment, you're never going to be able to appreciate it and map an attack path like you need to. So my number one recommendation would be for cloud security architects. That's the very first I see everybody looking for right now, and it's something that I can't see ever losing value for you, ever. My preference is AWS prior to Azure, but it depends on the market. If you're going into something like public service, start with Azure. If you're going into private companies, start with AWS. So that's where I would begin. Does that answer your question?
Oh yes, it does. So what I was looking at was on a typical day when people are doing pen testing, they ask you, oh, can you do a web app? Can you do an API, which is like
Yeah,
the web services? But
yeah,
at the end of the day, you find out that these people always, most companies are just depending on cloud services.
mm,
And it's not everybody that has the thorough knowledge as they would have for of cloud services as compared to the traditional one, because
yeah,
they're expecting, oh, if I run this, the error messages are giving me the versions of the server, is giving me certain information. That's a
yeah.
typical thing. But for the cloud one, I don't think the understanding has really reached there. So architectural aspects of things will also build up. So yes, thank you. It answered my question.
You're welcome. And then to add to that, I think you're absolutely right. I'm definitely seeing it across all the technical experts, not just across the within the work that I do, but like say understanding the huge differences between a cloud network and a traditional network, like you say, and they are huge. Um, and maintaining it, the maintenance of it, the language around it. It's literally as if I just need to suddenly do my job tomorrow and do it in Dutch I need to learn that language in order to do it. And it's the same if you're going to move to something like a cybersecurity in OT, cybersecurity in even within AD, there's a slight difference to the language that you're doing. So if you're going to be focused on cloud security, absolutely. Yeah, you're going to need to know how to speak the language and then how to relate that language to a traditional network, because most companies, and I'm sure there are exceptions out there, are not 100% cloud. If nothing else, you're all sitting in front of laptops, no doubt, today. So there are some things that are physical and sitting in front of you. So you're still going to need to know how to maintain a traditional network, even if 99% of it is cloud. But you need to understand and appreciate the differences between the two, and that'll definitely do that for you. Cool. Any other questions? Nope. Cool. I'll hand back to the girls then.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this session. That was really
Welcome.
informative. And if there'll be more questions, members can reach out to you on the channels, maybe Slack or Mighty, wherever they want to touch base with you.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll just stop the recording. Thank you so much.